The man standing in the center of the training floor looked like he didn't belong there. No tailored suit, no military insignia, just worn boots, a faded jacket, and the kind of quiet that made experienced fighters nervous. 6 of the company's best trained security personnel had been told to evaluate him. They expected to be done in under 2 minutes. They were right about the time. They were wrong about everything else. When the last man hit the mat and the room went silent, Ethan Cole straightened his collar, picked up the coffee cup he'd set down before the fight, and said 7 words that changed everything. Your enemy is already inside the building. Before we go further, if this kind of story is what keeps you up at night, hit that subscribe button right now and join this channel so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The town of Briar Point sat on the edge of the Oregon coast like something the rest of the country had quietly forgotten. The harbor smelled like diesel and salt. The storefronts on Main Street had been the same storefronts for 20 years. The people who stayed in Briar Point had either run out of reasons to leave or had found one strong enough to make them stop running. Ethan Cole had found his reason 8 years ago. Her name was Lily, and she was 7 years old now, and every morning she left 2 pieces of toast on the kitchen counter because she knew her father always forgot to eat before work. She also left a drawing. Some mornings it was a dog, other mornings a boat. Once it had been a very ambitious attempt at a dragon, taped to the handle of his toolbox so he'd see it when he grabbed his gear. This particular Tuesday, the drawing was a lighthouse. Ethan stood at the kitchen counter looking at it for longer than he probably should have. He drank his coffee cold because he'd forgotten to drink it hot. Outside, the fog was still thick off the water, the kind that made the streetlights glow orange even at 7 in the morning. "You're doing the thing," Lily said from behind him. He turned. She was standing in the doorway in her school uniform, the plaid one she complained about every single morning, with her backpack already on and her hair in a lopsided ponytail she'd done herself. "What thing?" "The thing where you stare at stuff and pretend you're not thinking." "I'm not thinking." "You're definitely thinking." She walked past him and grabbed a piece of toast. "Mrs. Abernethy says the fog will clear by noon." "Mrs. Abernethy's been wrong about the weather every day this month." "She's been optimistic. That's different." Lily looked at him over the edge of her toast. "You're going to be late." He wasn't late. He was never late. But he kissed the top of her head and grabbed his toolbox and walked down to the workshop on Harbor Road, where he spent his days fixing outboard motors, broken hydraulic lifts, the occasional generator that had been dropped off a boat dock. It wasn't complicated work. That was partly why he'd chosen it. He didn't want complicated. The job offer arrived in the form of a phone call from a number he didn't recognize, which he almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, the kind of voice that was used to people saying yes before the full sentence was finished. "Mr. Cole, my name is Sandra Holt. I'm the executive assistant to Avery Caldwell, CEO of Caldwell Innovations. Ms. Caldwell would like to speak with you about a security consulting opportunity. Would you be available Thursday afternoon?" Ethan was in the middle of draining a fuel line. He held the phone against his shoulder with his chin. "Where'd you get this number?" A brief pause. "A mutual contact, former government work." "I don't do that kind of work anymore." "Ms. Caldwell is aware of your background. She's specifically requesting you." "Then she should request someone else." He hung up. The phone rang again 40 seconds later. Same number. He almost didn't answer that one either. "Mr. Cole." Different voice this time. Younger, slightly impatient in a way that sounded like it was usually better disguised. "This is Avery Caldwell. I'm sorry for the abrupt introduction. I know you weren't expecting this call." "I wasn't expecting either call," he said. "Who gave you my name?" "Ray Dunbar. He said you were the only person he'd trust to walk into a situation where he couldn't see the exits." Ethan set down the fuel line. Ray Dunbar had been his team's intelligence coordinator for 4 years. The man didn't give referrals. He didn't believe in them. He'd once told Ethan that recommending someone was the fastest way to ruin 2 careers at once. "Ray said that?" "Word for word." She let a beat pass. "Mr. Cole, I have a company facing a series of threats that my current security team cannot explain or stop. I have an important announcement in 11 days that could determine the future of this company. And I have a board of directors breathing down my neck and executives I'm not sure I can trust." Her voice didn't waver, but something in the cadence of it shifted, just slightly. I need someone who actually knows what a real threat looks like, not someone who's good at looking like they do. He wiped his hands on a shop rag, looked out the window at the harbor. Thursday, he said. 1 o'clock. We'll send a car. I'll drive myself. He didn't tell Lilia about it that evening. He wasn't sure why. Partly because he didn't know what to tell her. Partly because he knew she'd ask questions he didn't have answers to yet. And Lily had this way of pulling answers out of him before he'd thought them through. And he didn't like making decisions before he'd thought them through. He made her dinner instead. Pasta with the jarred sauce she liked, the one with basil, even though he thought it tasted like something a food company thought basil should taste like. She talked about her friend Danny's dog having puppies, and a science project about tidal patterns, and a book she was reading about a girl who discovers she can communicate with birds. "Do you think that's actually possible?" she asked. "Like, scientifically?" "No. But animals do communicate. We just don't understand it. That's different from a girl suddenly being able to speak bird." "You're so literal." She twirled pasta around her fork. "You used to have more imagination." He looked at her. "When?" "When I was little." She said it matter-of-factly, like it was obvious. "You used to make up whole stories about the boats in the harbor. You gave them all names and histories." He didn't remember doing that, but he believed her. "People change," he said. "People get boring," she replied, not unkindly. He laughed despite himself, and she looked briefly pleased about that. And they finished dinner without him mentioning Avery Caldwell or Caldwell Innovations, or the strange weight that had been sitting behind his sternum since the phone call. The Caldwell Innovations headquarters in Portland was the kind of building that was designed to communicate success before you walked through the door. Glass and steel and sharp angles, 14 stories, the company name spelled out in brushed aluminum letters above the entrance that caught the morning light in a way that was definitely intentional. Ethan pulled into the parking structure in his truck, a 12-year-old Silverado with a cracked side mirror and 240,000 miles on it, and parked between a Mercedes and a BMW that together probably cost more than his house. He took the elevator to the lobby and told the front desk who he was. The receptionist, young, carefully professional, looked at him once, then at her screen, then back at him with the particular expression of someone recalibrating. "Of course, Mr. Cole. Someone will be right down." The someone who came down was a man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with a security badge, and the deliberate walk of someone who wanted you to notice how deliberate his walk was. He had the kind of face that was used to being the most authoritative thing in the room. "Marcus Vane," the man said, extending his hand. "Director of Security Operations." Ethan shook it. "Ethan Cole." "Right." Marcus's grip was firm in the particular way that meant something. "Ms. Caldwell asked me to bring you up and give you a brief orientation before your meeting with her." He was already walking toward the elevators. "You have a background in equipment maintenance?" "Workshop repair. Before that, Navy." "Navy." Marcus nodded slowly, the way people nodded when they were deciding how to categorize something. "Ms. Caldwell mentioned you were recommended by an outside contact. What kind of security work have you done recently?" "Quiet kind." Marcus glanced at him sideways. "Meaning?" "Meaning it was quiet." A small silence. They stepped into the elevator. "Our team here is highly trained," Marcus said. "Former law enforcement, private sector specialists, corporate security veterans. We run a serious operation." "Good to know." "I just want to be clear about expectations." The elevator doors opened on the 10th floor. "This is a complex environment. High-profile clients, sensitive operations, things that require specific expertise. Not everyone who comes in as a consultant understands the—" "Marcus." Ethan stopped walking. Marcus turned. "I'm not here to compete with your team," Ethan said. "I'm here because someone asked me to look at a problem. If your team already solved it, I'll be out by end of day." Marcus held his gaze for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes that wasn't quite confidence. "Fair enough," he said, and kept walking. Avery Caldwell was not what Ethan had been picturing. He wasn't sure what he'd been picturing exactly. Something more corporate, more managed, the kind of polished presentation that people in her position usually built around themselves like armor. She was 30, younger than she'd sounded on the phone, with dark hair pulled back practically, and clothes that were expensive but worn like she'd forgotten to think about them. She was standing at her desk when he came in, not sitting, and she was looking at something on a tablet with the focused expression of someone trying to solve a math problem that refused to cooperate. She looked up when he entered and crossed to him with her hand out. "Mr. Cole, thank you for coming." "Ethan." He shook her hand. Her grip was direct. "Avery." She gestured to the chair across from her desk, but didn't sit herself. "I've read the background my contact pulled together on you. Not much there." "No." "That's either because you're very private or because a lot of it is classified." "Both," he said. She studied him briefly. Not the assessment of someone trying to be impressive, more the look of someone genuinely trying to figure something out. "Why'd you leave?" He'd expected other questions first. Most people eased up to that one. "Personal reasons," he said. She nodded once, accepting that without pushing it. "Ray said you see things other people miss, that you read a situation differently." "Ray says things he can't always back up." "He also said you saved his life twice, and he never figured out how you knew something was wrong before it happened." She set the tablet down on the desk. "I want to know if something's wrong. My security team keeps telling me everything is under control, but I don't feel like anything is under control." "What's happened?" She walked him through it in the efficient way of someone who had rehearsed the telling enough times to strip it down to facts. 3 incidents over 5 months. A cyber intrusion attempt that was caught but never fully explained. A confrontation at a company off-site where an unidentified individual had accessed the parking area and photographed her vehicle. And 2 weeks ago, a threatening message left on her personal phone, a number she'd given to fewer than 12 people. "Personal phone," he said. "Yes." "Not your work line?" "No." "So whoever left that message either has access to your private contact information or got it from someone who does." She looked at him. "That's what I think too, but when I raised it, they told you it was probably a coincidence or a data breach from a third-party app." "Word for word." He nodded slowly. "Can I see the security reports?" "All of them. From the past 18 months, not just the incident reports. The daily logs." "Marcus controls most of those." "I know. Can you get them without going through him?" A pause. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You're already suspicious of someone inside." "I'm suspicious of the pattern," he said. "That's different." She held his gaze for a moment, then reached for her desk phone. "I'll have it pull them directly." He didn't get to the logs that day, because Marcus Vane had arranged something else first. He called it an orientation. What it actually was, and Ethan recognized this within about 30 seconds of walking into the company's ground floor training facility, was an audition designed to fail. 6 men in the room. All of them bigger than average, all of them carrying the easy confidence of people who'd won a lot of physical confrontations. Marcus stood at the edge of the space with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who'd already written the ending. "Standard evaluation for new security consultants," Marcus said. "Nothing unusual. We need to know your capabilities match your reputation." Ethan looked at the 6 men, looked at Marcus. Then he set his coffee cup down on a nearby bench. "Okay," he said. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not a fight in any way most people would have recognized as a fight. It was more like a series of decisions made faster than the people on the receiving end could process. The first man came in predictably. A left side grab followed by a right cross setup, the kind of combination that worked on people who watched the hands. Ethan didn't watch the hands. He watched the shoulders. He wasn't fast in the way that looked dramatic. He was fast in the way that was actually useful. The quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years removing every wasted motion from the way he moved. By the time 3 of the 6 were on the mat, the remaining 3 had slowed down. That instinct, the instinct to pause and reassess, was the thing that finished them. You didn't pause in a room with Ethan Cole. Pausing was an invitation. The last man went down with a controlled takedown that left him flat on his back, blinking at the ceiling. The room was very quiet. Ethan walked back to the bench and picked up his coffee. Marcus hadn't moved. His expression had changed in a way he was working hard not to show. "Satisfied?" Ethan asked. Marcus uncrossed his arms. "Impressive. But this company operates in boardrooms and conference halls, not training facilities." "I know." Ethan took a sip of his coffee. It was cold now. "That's what worries me." He turned and walked toward the elevator, then stopped, turned back. "One thing," he said. Marcus looked at him. Your security team isn't failing because they can't stop an attack. Ethan looked around the room, at the men still pulling themselves up, at the cameras in the corners he'd counted when he walked in, at the logs on the sign-in clipboard by the door that he'd glanced at for less than 3 seconds and already memorized. They're failing because someone is helping the attack happen. He held Marcus's gaze for just a moment. Then he walked out. Behind him, Marcus Vane stood very still in the silent training room. The only movement was the slight tightening of his jaw, a small, involuntary thing that nobody in the room was looking for. Nobody except from the doorway where she'd watched the last 30 seconds with her arms crossed and her face carefully blank, Avery Caldwell. She'd been standing there long enough, she'd seen enough. She pulled out her phone and called IT directly. I need 18 months of security logs pulled to my personal drive, she said quietly. Don't route it through Marcus's office. Just send it straight to me. She hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, feeling the strange and unsettling sensation of a certainty settling into her chest. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that tells you the thing you were afraid to believe might actually be true. The logs arrived on Avery's personal drive at 11:17 that night. She knew because she was still at her desk when the notification came through, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that she'd sent everyone home 2 hours earlier and locked her office door, something she almost never did. The locking the door part. She was used to being alone in the building late. That was just the life she'd built for herself over the past 6 years, trading evenings and weekends for a company that now employed 400 people and held 3 active government contracts. But she didn't usually lock the door. She did tonight. She forwarded the files to Ethan without reading them herself. Not because she was avoiding them, but because she'd realized somewhere between the training room and her office that what she needed wasn't her own interpretation of 18 months of security data. She needed someone who knew what they were looking at. His reply came back in 4 minutes. I'll start tonight. Can you send me your complete travel calendar for the past year? Not the public one. She stared at that last part for a moment. Not the public one. She sent it. Ethan spread the files across his kitchen table at midnight with a cup of coffee. He actually drank hot this time, and he worked the way he'd always worked, not looking for answers, looking for shape. Patterns didn't announce themselves. They hid inside the ordinary. They lived in the spaces between things that seemed unrelated until you put them in sequence and stepped back far enough to see what they were pointing at. By 2 in the morning, he'd found the first thread. By 3:30, he'd pulled it enough to see where it led. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Lily's lighthouse drawing was still on the table beside him, pushed to the edge to make room for the papers. He looked at it briefly, then looked back at his notes. Every incident, every single one across 18 months, had occurred within 48 hours of someone inside the company accessing Avery's private travel itinerary through the executive scheduling system. Not her public calendar. Not the version her assistant maintained for routine meetings. The private one. The document that tracked her off-site movements, her personal appointments, her unannounced visits to satellite offices. The access timestamps were buried in the system logs under routine administrative entries. Easy to miss if you were scanning. Easy to overlook if you weren't asking the right question. But if you asked the right question, who knew where she was before each incident, the answer kept pointing back to the same narrow window of access. He wrote down 2 words and circled them. Inside job. Then he sat there for a while, not because he didn't know what to do next, but because he'd been here before. This particular intersection of knowing something and not yet being able to prove it without tipping off the person who needed to not know he was coming. He'd lived at this intersection during 4 years of field work, and it always felt the same, like standing on ice you couldn't see the thickness of. You moved carefully, or you didn't move at all. He called Avery at 7 the next morning. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake. Your travel calendar was accessed before each incident, he said. Same system, same access window. A silence. How many people have access to that system? According to the permission logs, 14, but I need to cross-reference who is actually active in the system versus who has passive access they never use. I can pull that. Don't, he said. Don't pull it yourself and don't ask it to run it. If someone's watching the access queries, they'll know someone's looking. Then how do you get it? I need to be inside your building, working. Not as a consultant, as part of your team, at least on paper, so I have a reason to be in rooms I shouldn't be in. Another silence. Longer this time. Marcus isn't going to accept that, she said. Marcus isn't the one who gets to decide that. He paused. Is he? She didn't answer immediately. He let the question sit. No, she said finally. He's not. He drove back to Portland that morning and arrived at Caldwell Innovations just before 10. Avery had left a temporary access badge for him at the front desk, the kind that gave building access but not system access, deliberately limited, which Marcus would find acceptable and which suited Ethan fine. He wasn't there for the systems yet. He spent the first hour walking the building, not the executive floors, the rest of it, the loading dock, the server room corridor, the parking structure, the secondary stairwells, the places that didn't show up on the corporate floor plan because nobody thought to include them. He walked slowly, like someone who was oriented, stopping occasionally to check his phone and looked like he was reading something. He counted cameras, noted blind spots, measured response times in his head by watching how long it took the nearest security personnel to notice him in spaces where he shouldn't be comfortable. The answer was too long, every time. He was in the parking structure when he found the first piece. Avery's car, a gray Audi A6, the plate number he'd memorized from the travel logs, was parked in a reserved executive space near the elevator bank on level 2. He walked past it twice before he crouched down beside the rear wheel well. The device was small. Magnetic mount. Professionally installed, meaning it was seated flush against the metal without any of the gaps an amateur left when they were working too fast or too nervous. He didn't touch it. He took a photo on his phone, precise enough to show the model, then straightened up and kept walking like he'd been looking at his shoe. Back at the lobby level, he stopped at the security station near the elevator. The guard on duty was young, late 20s, the kind of focused but bored expression of someone 4 hours into an 8-hour shift. Hey, Ethan said. Quick question. The parking structure cameras on level 2. When's the last time someone ran a coverage audit on those? The guard looked at him. Who are you? Ethan Cole. I'm working with Ms. Caldwell on a security review. He showed the badge. The guard typed something, confirmed, looked back up. I'd have to check. That's not really my... I'm not asking for a report. Just rough idea. Weeks? Months? The guard thought about it. Honestly, probably 3 months at least. Maybe more. Thanks. Ethan turned to walk away. Is there a problem with the cameras? Not with the cameras, Ethan said. I was in Avery's office by noon. She was standing at the window with her arms crossed when he came in, looking out over the city with the expression of someone doing math they didn't like the answer to. There's a tracking device on your car, he said. Level 2 parking, rear driver's side wheel well. Don't remove it yet. She turned from the window. Why not? Because whoever put it there doesn't know we found it. That's useful. He sat down across from her desk, which he'd noticed she still hadn't sat behind. She operated in front of the desk, not behind it. He filed that detail away as something he understood about her. Tell me about the company announcement. 11 days. What is it exactly? She came away from the window and sat in the chair beside his, not the one behind the desk. We've spent 4 years developing an autonomous logistics management system. Not theoretical, fully operational, government tested. The announcement is the first commercial licensing deal. $43 million contract with a private infrastructure firm. Competitors? 3. 2 of them have been trying to buy us out for the past 18 months. The third one filed a patent challenge 6 weeks ago that our legal team says is frivolous but expensive. Who knows the details of the deal? The specific terms, the client name, the timing? My senior leadership team, legal, and the board. All of them? She paused at that, just a half second. All of them. How many board members? 7. And your senior leadership, how many? 5, including Marcus. Ethan looked at her steadily. Avery, someone sold your movements to whoever is running these threats against you. The tracking device, the personal phone number, the access to your private calendar. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a data breach. That's a person inside your organization with access and motive. The announcement in 11 days is the deadline. That's why the pressure is building. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was level but tight at the edges. You're telling me one of the people I've worked with for years is, what exactly? Trying to destroy my company? Or trying to control it, he said. Destruction is messy. Control is more profitable. She stood up and walked back to the window. He let her. Marcus, she said. Not a question exactly. I haven't confirmed anything. But he knew about the training room ambush before I was told the schedule. He was already in the building when I arrived, already set up. And the permission logs show his access level would include the scheduling system. He paused. But so do 3 other people on your senior team. I need more before I say it's him specifically. She turned from the window. How do you get more? I set up a test, he said. The test was simple the way the effective ones usually were. Ethan asked Avery to create a false entry in her private scheduling system, an off-site meeting at a specific location at a specific time, logged under her travel calendar, marked confidential. A meeting that didn't exist, a location she would never actually go to. Then they waited. Ethan spent 2 days doing what he was supposed to be doing, walking the building, meeting with her security personnel, producing a written assessment of physical vulnerabilities that was genuine enough to be useful and also served as perfect cover for the fact that he was spending those same 2 days watching people. He ate lunch in the company cafeteria. He made small talk. He asked the kind of questions that seemed operational and were actually personal. What he was learning wasn't in any security report. He was learning who talked to whom. He was learning who left the building at unusual times. He was learning that one of Avery's senior analysts, a quiet man named Garrett Lyle, went noticeably pale every time Marcus Vane walked past his desk. He was learning that Marcus arrived every morning exactly 20 minutes before his stated start time, and that those 20 minutes were unaccounted for in his calendar. On the evening of the second day, Ethan drove to the address he'd logged as the fake meeting location. It was a parking lot beside a dry cleaning shop in a commercial district east of downtown. The kind of place you'd choose for surveillance because there was nowhere obvious to stand and look like you belonged. He parked down the block and watched for 90 minutes. 40 minutes in, a black SUV pulled into the lot and sat there with its engine running. Ethan took photos of the plate. He didn't move. The SUV stayed for 22 minutes and then left. He ran the plate from his phone through a contact he still had from his old life, one of the handful he'd kept, because some bridges you didn't burn even when you were done crossing them. The result came back in 6 hours. The SUV was registered to a private security firm called Duran Group LLC, a company that, when he searched it, had no public clients listed and no operational history. A shell, or close to one. He started pulling the thread on Duran Group. You need to know something, Ethan said. He was standing in Avery's office the next morning with a folder he'd assembled from his overnight work. He laid it on her desk. Printouts, timestamps, the photo of the SUV and the lot. Avery looked through it without speaking. He watched her read. She was fast. She processed information the way people who had spent years in high-stakes decision rooms learned to, stripping it down to the relevant parts without getting stuck on the details. When she looked up, there were 2 spots of color on her cheeks. Someone showed up at a meeting that didn't exist, she said. Yes. And the only people who knew about that meeting were the people with access to my private calendar. Yes. She set the folder down carefully, like she was trying not to do it harder than she meant to. Duran Group. I found 3 payments from a private account connected to Duran Group. They go back 14 months. The source account is obscured, but it routes through a holding company that has the same registered agent as a personal investment vehicle belonging to a member of your organization. She stared at him. Who? I need one more verification step. If I'm wrong, I've just accused someone of something that ends careers. He looked at her directly. I'm not going to do that until I'm sure. And if you're right, then we move carefully. Because if whoever this is gets any indication we're close, they will accelerate everything. And you have 9 days until your announcement. She was quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't uncertainty. It was controlled anger looking for the right shape to take. What do you need? She asked. I need access to the financial records in your legal archive. Specifically, the executive compensation and investment disclosure filings from the past 2 years. Those are outside the security system's purview. I'll get them. Quietly. I know. She picked up the folder again, then set it back down. Ethan, She said his name like she was testing the weight of it. Why does someone with your background spend his time fixing boat engines in a town no one's heard of? He hadn't expected that question right then. He looked at her for a moment. Because engines don't lie to you, he said. They either work or they don't. She nodded slowly, not pushing further. He appreciated that. Marcus found him in the second-floor corridor that afternoon. Not accidentally. Ethan could tell the difference between someone who happened to cross your path and someone who had timed it. Marcus came from the direction of the executive elevator with 2 cups of coffee and the body language of a man who had decided to be friendly and found it slightly uncomfortable. "Got a minute?" Marcus said. "Sure." Marcus handed him one of the cups, which Ethan accepted without reading too much into it. They stood at the windows overlooking the central atrium below. "How's the assessment coming?" Marcus asked. "Making progress." "Find anything you didn't expect?" Ethan glanced at him sideways. "A few things. I'll have a preliminary report for Avery by end of the week." "Good." Marcus sipped his coffee. "Listen, I'll be honest with you. I was skeptical when she brought you in. Not personal. I just think there's a value to institutional knowledge. People who know how this company operates, what the threat environment actually looks like from inside." "Makes sense." "But the evaluation you ran the other day," Marcus paused, something careful in the pause. "That was legitimate. I'll give you that." "Thank you. What I'd want going forward is communication. If you find something, anything, that relates to operational security, you bring it to me directly. We run a tight ship and surprises don't help anyone." Ethan looked at him, held the look for just a half-second longer than was comfortable. "Of course," he said. "You'll be the first to know." Marcus nodded, satisfied or performing satisfaction well enough that the difference didn't matter right now. He clapped Ethan once on the shoulder and walked back toward the elevator. Ethan stood at the window and watched the atrium below. Down there, a cluster of company employees were moving between departments, carrying tablets, talking, living inside their ordinary workday without any knowledge of what was happening in the floors above them. He thought about what Marcus had just asked him. "If you find something, bring it to me directly." He thought about the SUV in the parking lot. He thought about the tracking device on Avery's car that was still there, still reporting, transmitting her location to someone who was watching. He finished the coffee and went back to work. The confirmation came 3 days before he was ready for it. He'd been working through the financial disclosure files Avery had pulled quietly from legal archives. Dense reading, the kind that required patience and a particular tolerance for the way money moved when it didn't want to be followed. He'd gotten good at this during his SEAL years, not because financial intelligence was his specialty, but because he'd learned that the logistics of a threat, the money, the routing, the shell companies, was always less careful than the operational side. People who planned violence were meticulous. People who funded it tended to believe the complexity of the structure was protection enough. It wasn't. The connection he found was in an executive investment disclosure form filed 22 months ago. The kind of document that was technically public record but practically invisible because nobody read them. Marcus Vane had disclosed a minority stake in a private equity vehicle called Corlin Partners. Corlin Partners, when Ethan cross-referenced it against the corporate registry of Duran Group's registered agent filings, shared a legal address with the holding company that had made those 3 payments. It wasn't a straight line. It was 3 steps through deliberately obscured corporate structures. But it was there. He sat with the documents for 20 minutes before he called Avery. "It's Marcus," he said, when she picked up. She didn't say anything for a long moment. "You're sure?" "I can show you the documentation. It's not a confession, but it's enough to open an independent investigation. And once an investigation opens, whatever else Marcus has been doing will surface." He heard her breathing on the other end, just breathing, which told him she was holding herself together carefully. "He's been with this company for 6 years, she said. "I know. He was at my going public party. He gave a toast." Her voice was flat but not broken. "He said I'd built something that would last." Ethan didn't have anything to say to that. He didn't try to fill the silence with something useful sounding. "What do we do?" she asked. "We don't move yet," he said. 8 days until the announcement. If we move now, Marcus accelerates whatever he has planned and we lose control of the timeline. We need to get through the announcement, protect it, and build enough evidence that when we act, it sticks. And in the meantime, I walk around this building knowing that my security director is selling information about me to someone who wants to take everything I've built. Yes, he said. I'm sorry. That's what we have to do. Another silence. How do you do it? She asked. Walk into something knowing it might go wrong and just keep walking. He thought about Lily's lighthouse drawing on his kitchen table, about the cold coffee and the midnight logs and the particular quality of the dark at 3 in the morning when you were the only one awake in a quiet house. You focus on the thing in front of you, he said. You deal with what you can see. And you trust that if you do that right, you'll get to the next thing. She was quiet for a moment. Then, okay, he said. He drove back to Briar Point that night. Lily was already asleep when he got home. He stood in the doorway of her room for a minute, the way he sometimes did, not watching her sleep the way people described in sentimental stories, more just standing there in the fact of her. The fact that she was here and fine, and tomorrow morning she'd leave toast on the counter and tell him he was too literal. He went to the kitchen and made actual dinner for once, not pasta, just eggs and toast. He sat at the table where the security logs were still stacked at one end, and he ate. And he thought about Marcus Vane giving a toast at a party 6 years ago, telling a woman she'd built something that would last. He thought about the kind of person who did that, who smiled at someone's success while quietly building the architecture of their destruction, who wore a badge that said security and used it to open every door the threat needed. The thing that had bothered Ethan since the first day wasn't really the tracking device, or the phone number, or even the financial connections. It was that Marcus was good at this. Patient. The operation he'd run against Avery wasn't impulsive. It was layered and long-term and careful. 14 months of payments. 3 years of positioning. This wasn't a man who'd gotten greedy. This was a man who'd had a plan from the beginning. And men with plans from the beginning were dangerous for a reason that had nothing to do with physical threat. They thought ahead, which meant somewhere, already, Marcus had contingencies Ethan hadn't found yet. He put his plate in the sink and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark harbor. Somewhere out there, the water was making its usual sound, the low, restless sound it made when the tide was turning, when everything was in motion but not yet committed to its direction. 8 days, he thought. He needed to be ready for something he couldn't fully see yet. That was the job. It had always been the job. And the part of him that had spent 8 years trying to forget he was good at it felt it settling back into place with the quiet, unwelcome certainty of something that had never actually left. The 8 days passed the way the period before something bad usually does. Too fast in some places, unbearably slow in others, with a texture that felt slightly off, like a room where someone had moved all the furniture 2 inches and you couldn't identify what was wrong, but your body kept telling you something was. Ethan spent most of those days inside Caldwell Innovations. He had a temporary workspace now, a small office off the second-floor corridor that had previously been used for storage and still smelled faintly of toner cartridges and old paper. He'd been given it without fanfare, which meant Avery had arranged it without routing it through Marcus, which was the right move. He'd set up with a laptop, a legal pad, and a thermos of coffee. He refilled twice a day from the break room down the hall. He used those trips to the break room deliberately. The 30-second walk each way. The 60 seconds of waiting while the machine cycled. People talked differently in break rooms than they did in conference rooms or open offices. Their guard came down half a notch. Not enough to say anything they'd regret, usually, but enough to say things they hadn't planned to say, which was where you found the edges of things. He learned that 2 of Avery's senior analysts were quietly interviewing at other firms, the kind of lateral anxiety that ran through companies facing uncertainty. He learned that the administrative team had been told the announcement event would include a cocktail hour and a presentation to 400 guests, and that catering had already been contracted, and that 3 senior board members were flying in from New York. He learned that Garrett Lyle, the quiet analyst he'd noticed going pale when Marcus passed, had been with the company since its 2nd year, had apparently been up for a promotion 3 years ago that Marcus had quietly killed. Nobody came out and said that. They said it the way people said things in break rooms, in pieces, without connecting the pieces themselves. Ethan connected them. He also spent those 8 days watching Marcus without looking like he was watching Marcus, which required a particular kind of patience. Marcus was not careless. He operated with the confidence of someone who believed he had already won, and that confidence made him slightly less careful than he would have been otherwise, but only slightly. He conducted his meetings normally. He ran his security briefings at their usual times. He interfaced with Avery in the professional, slightly performative way he always did, and Avery, to her considerable credit, responded to him exactly as she always had, without a single visible crack in the surface. Ethan had told her she needed to behave normally around Marcus, and she'd said, "I understand," and he'd believed her, but he'd also half expected the human reality of it to get in the way. It didn't. Whatever. Avery Caldwell felt about what Marcus Vane had done. The 6 years of trust poisoned quietly from inside. She kept it somewhere below the waterline where it didn't show. He respected that. It was also, he recognized, something that was probably costing her. On the 5th day, he asked her about it. They were in her office after 7, the building mostly emptied out, and she was going through the final event logistics for the announcement and looked like someone who hadn't slept enough in slightly too long. "How are you holding up?" he asked. She looked up from the papers. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." She set down her pen, sat back. "I keep replaying conversations, things he said in meetings. The time he spent 2 hours with me after a board fight, talking me through it, being, seemingly, genuinely on my side." She paused. "And I'm trying to figure out which parts were real and which parts were the job. And I think maybe none of it was real. And that's—" She stopped. "It's fine. I'll deal with it later." "You don't have to deal with it later by yourself," he said. "That's all I mean." She looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her expression. Not dramatically, just a small recalibration of the careful composure she wore like a second skin. "Thanks," she said, quietly, like she meant it. He nodded and went back to his notes, and she went back to hers, and neither of them said anything else for a while. But the quality of the silence was different than it had been before. 3 days before the announcement, Ethan found the second layer. He'd been reviewing the event logistics document, the technical setup for the announcement presentation, the AV configuration, the security rotations Marcus had planned, and he'd felt the thing he sometimes felt, a low and wordless unease, the kind that didn't come with an explanation attached. He'd learned a long time ago not to interrogate that feeling, but to follow it. He followed it into the specifics of Marcus's security deployment plan. On paper, the plan was thorough. Perimeter security, lobby control, elevator access management, credential verification at the event entrance. All of it checked out against standard protocol for a high-profile corporate event. Except for one thing. The secondary stairwells, the service routes he'd walked on his first day in the building, were assigned to a rotating patrol that cycled every 40 minutes, standard practice. But the deployment schedule Marcus had submitted placed those patrol rotations at timings that created a consistent 7-minute window 3 times during the event, where both secondary stairwells would be simultaneously uncovered. Not obviously. Not if you were reading the schedule as a schedule. Only if you laid it against a floor map and traced the patrol routes by hand. Ethan traced them by hand. 7 minutes. 3 windows. The first one occurring 12 minutes after the presentation was scheduled to begin, when every eye in the room would be on Avery and the screen behind her. He sat with that for an hour. Then he made a call. The person who answered was named Diane, and she'd worked in federal law enforcement for 19 years before leaving for a private consulting practice. And she was one of 4 people from Ethan's old life that he'd kept in his phone under first names only. "I need a favor," he said. "Off record. Observation only, no action." "What am I looking at?" "A corporate event, 400 people, 3 days from now. I need 2 sets of eyes that aren't connected to the in-house security operation." A pause. "What's the threat level?" "I think someone's going to try to take control of the company during the event itself. I don't know the mechanism yet." "Physical threat or financial?" "Both, possibly. The physical piece is my job. I need someone watching the financial channels, the board communications, the document systems, in case something gets filed or transmitted during the chaos." "That's a specific ask." "It's a specific situation." Another pause. "I'll make some calls, no guarantees. That's all I need." He hung up and wrote 2 pages of notes. Everything he knew, in order, with the gaps clearly marked. He'd been taught early that the gaps were as important as the information. What you didn't know shaped what you needed to find out. What he didn't know yet was what the physical piece looked like. How Marcus intended to use the 7-minute window. What came through the uncovered stairwell, and when, and aimed at what. He was still working that problem when his phone rang at 11:15 that night. The number was blocked. He answered. Cole. The voice was familiar in the way that made your jaw tighten before your brain caught up with why. Low, measured, slightly too deliberate in its calm. Marcus Vane. Hate to call this late. Something's come up. Ethan kept his voice exactly where it was. What kind of something? Avery's getting some last-minute nerves about the event. Wants to do a full walkthrough of the security plan tomorrow morning. Early. 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock. She asked me to include you. I'll be there. Good. A pause. You settling in all right? Building can be a lot to take in. Managing fine, Ethan said. Good, good. Another pause that lasted about 1 second too long. See you tomorrow morning. The call ended. Ethan sat for a moment. Avery had not texted him about any 6 o'clock meeting. He checked his phone. Nothing from her. He typed a message. Did you schedule a walkthrough for tomorrow morning at 6? Her reply came 3 minutes later. No. What are you talking about? He looked at the phone for a moment. Then he typed back. Keep your door locked tonight. Don't go anywhere in the building without telling me first. Her response? You're scaring me. He thought about how to answer that. Then typed. Good. Stay scared. It keeps you careful. He didn't sleep that night. He went back to the security deployment plan and took it apart from the beginning, looking for everything he'd accepted on first read as standard. People like Marcus counted on the first read. They built their deceptions to survive the first read and fail only under the kind of scrutiny that most people never applied, because most people were not expecting to be deceived by someone whose job was protecting them. By 4 in the morning, he had it. The cameras. The security system's camera network ran through a central management console maintained by the IT security division, which fell under Marcus's operational authority. Standard configuration. Cameras on, recording, monitored by the overnight security detail. Nothing unusual. But buried in a maintenance log from 6 weeks ago was a scheduled firmware update for the camera management system. Routine, approved, documented. Except the update version listed didn't match the current firmware version in the system manifest. A discrepancy of 3 numbers. The kind of thing that looked like a clerical error and almost certainly wasn't. He'd seen this before. Not in corporate environments, in field operations. A firmware update that installed legitimate improvements and also installed a secondary function, a scheduled override that could, at a specified time, disable camera recording across all or selected zones while maintaining the visual feed to the monitoring station. The monitors would see live camera images. They wouldn't know nothing was being recorded. And more importantly, they wouldn't know the cameras could be remotely blinded. He had his mechanism. Marcus didn't need men through the stairwells. He needed the cameras off. He needed a window where nothing in the secondary routes was on record, where whatever he was moving, documents, people, data, left no trail. Ethan wrote it down, checked his notes, and then sat very still for about 30 seconds doing the math on what someone needed to do in an unrecorded 7-minute window during a major corporate event. Sign something, transfer something, access something that required physical proximity to a hardwired system. The board. 3 board members flying in from New York, 400 investors in the room, Avery on stage presenting a $43 million licensing deal. And somewhere in that building, Marcus creating a window where nobody was watching. He called Avery at 5 in the morning. She picked up on the first ring. I need you to move something, he said. What? The day of the announcement arrived gray and cold, the kind of Pacific Northwest morning that had no interest in being dramatic about itself. Ethan arrived at the building at 7. He'd had 4 hours of sleep on his couch in Briar Point and driven back before dawn with the windows down to stay sharp. The coffee he'd brought in a thermos was the real kind, the strong kind, and he drank it in the parking structure while doing one final check of the tracking device on Avery's car. Still there, still active, still feeding someone Avery's location data in real time. He'd asked her not to remove it. She hadn't. He appreciated that she could resist the instinct to act before the moment was right. Most people couldn't. Inside, the building was already moving. Event staff from the catering company were hauling equipment through the service entrance. The main event space on the sixth floor, a large glass-walled auditorium that Caldwell Innovations used for major presentations, was being configured with rows of seating, a stage, lighting rigs. It would hold 430 people tonight. Ethan had the floor plan memorized. He found Avery in her office at 8. She looked like she hadn't slept either, which was accurate, but she was put together in the way she always was. Like the external version of herself was a machine she could run regardless of what was happening internally. "Did you move it?" he asked. "Last night. It's where you said." He nodded. "And the board members from New York?" "Arriving at 2. I told them the pre-event briefing would be in the 4th floor conference room instead of the 6th. I said it was a catering conflict." "Good." He sat down. "Here's what I need you to understand about tonight. Whatever happens, whatever Marcus does or says or whatever you see, your job is to stay visible. Stay on stage. Stay in front of people. Do not let him pull you into a private conversation. And if he does something during the presentation, if he, I don't know, moves on something while I'm up there, that's what I'm there for. You can't be everywhere, Ethan." "No," he agreed, "but I've got people in the right places." She looked at him. "The contacts you mentioned." 2 people. They know what they're watching for." She was quiet for a moment, looking down at her desk. Then, "What happens if you're wrong? What if I go up on that stage tonight and nothing happens, and I've spent 3 weeks being afraid of someone I've worked with for 6 years, and it turns out, if I'm wrong," he said, "I'll write a very thorough apology and go back to fixing boat engines." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. Close to it. "Okay," she said. "Okay." The guests began arriving at 6. Ethan watched from the corridor outside the 6th floor auditorium, dressed in a dark jacket that let him blend into the event staff without being invisible to people who were looking for him. Avery had arranged a lapel credential that said "Event Operations and Ask No Questions." He watched the room fill. The energy in these rooms was always interesting. 400 people who'd been told they were witnessing something important, already half sold before the presentation began, generating a kind of ambient certainty that was contagious and also, in the right circumstances, exploitable. He moved through the room once, slowly, clocking where Marcus's security people were positioned. Lobby entry, 2 personnel. Elevator bank, 1. The main floor, 3. Scattered in the way that looked professional and was actually slightly too spread out to respond cohesively to anything that moved fast. Marcus himself was stationed near the stage entrance, hands clasped, monitoring his radio earpiece with the expression of a man in complete professional control of his environment. At 6:47, Ethan's phone buzzed. A text from Diane. "We're in. System access confirmed. Watching the board document portal." He typed back, "Stay on it." At 6:59, the lights in the auditorium dimmed and Avery walked onto the stage to applause. That was genuine and substantial, the kind that came from people who had watched a company grow from a well-funded startup into something they'd put real money behind. She looked good up there, not polished in the managed way. Present, slightly tense in the shoulders, which nobody in the audience would notice, but she was holding it, and she was real. And when she began speaking, her voice was level and clear and carried the room the way it needed to. Ethan was not watching Avery. He was watching Marcus. At 7:11, 12 minutes in, exactly as he'd calculated, Marcus said something quietly into his radio. Small mouth movement, designed to look like nothing. He shifted his position by the stage entrance and moved 2 of his floor personnel toward the main audience area. The secondary stairwells were now open. Ethan was already moving. He took the east corridor at a walk that was slightly faster than casual, turned left at the service junction, and came into the rear access corridor that ran behind the 6th floor's presentation space. The second stairwell was at the far end, a heavy door with a push bar and a camera above it that was, right now, showing a live feed of an empty corridor to a monitor station downstairs where nobody would see it wasn't recording. He pushed the door open and went down 1 floor. The 5th floor was administration and executive support. At 7 in the evening, during a major company event, it should have been empty. It wasn't. 2 men he didn't recognize were working at a terminal near the far end of the open plan office. Not loudly. They were moving quickly and quietly, with the focus of people who knew exactly how much time they had. One was at the keyboard. The other was watching the corridor. The watcher saw Ethan first. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not the clean cinematic kind of conflict. It was fast and uncomfortable, and the furniture took damage. The watcher came at him hard and fast and knew what he was doing, which meant Ethan had to commit earlier than he would have preferred. He took a hit to the left shoulder that was going to hurt tomorrow before he got the angle he needed, and put the man down against a desk that skidded 2 feet across the floor. The one at the keyboard ran. Ethan caught him at the stairwell door, held him against the frame by his collar. "What did you file?" Ethan said. The man was breathing hard. Young, probably late 20s, genuinely scared in the way that told Ethan he was the bottom of this operation, not the top. I just ran the script. I don't know what script? What does it do?" "It pushes a document package to the board portal. Authorization signatures. I don't know what the documents say." Ethan held him for another second. Then he pulled out his phone, called Diane. "Something just got pushed to the board document portal. Can you stop it?" "Already flagged it. It's a package of 3 documents. Looks like amended corporate authority agreements. They're sitting in the queue, not yet distributed." "Can you hold them there?" 10 minutes, maybe. After that, the system auto-distributes." "Hold them." He looked at the man he was still holding by the collar. "You're staying here." He zip-tied the man's wrist to a filing cabinet handle with the kit he kept in his jacket pocket, an old habit he'd never broken, and went back to the terminal. The screen was showing a document queue. He could see the package Diane had flagged, 3 files, staged for distribution to the 7 board members. He opened the first one. It was an emergency authority transfer document, signed, fraudulently, clearly, with a digital signature that had Avery's credentials attached, transferring operational control of Caldwell Innovations to its board of directors effective immediately, citing executive incapacitation. The second document was a board resolution, pre-filled, signed by 4 of the 7 board members, accepting the transfer and appointing an interim executive committee. The third was a press release. Ethan stared at the screen. It was elegant, in the cold way that well-planned betrayals were elegant. While Avery stood on a stage in front of 400 investors presenting the future of her company, Marcus had arranged for the legal machinery of her removal to process quietly 1 floor below. By the time the presentation ended and the applause faded, the documents would have been distributed, the board would have received official notice of a leadership change, and the chaos of 400 confused investors would provide the perfect cover for the story that followed. An executive who had lost control of her company during its most public moment. He understood now what Marcus had said to him on the phone 3 days ago, asking him to come in at 6 in the morning. It hadn't been a warning, it had been a test. Marcus had been checking whether Ethan was close enough to the truth to be a problem. He'd underestimated Ethan's answer. He typed a message to Diane. "Don't let those documents move. I'm going back upstairs." The auditorium was still full, still attentive, Avery's presentation still running when Ethan came back through the service corridor. He found Marcus at the stage entrance and came up beside him quietly, the way you came up beside people when you wanted the conversation to happen before they could redirect it. "It didn't work," Ethan said, low enough that it was just between them. Marcus didn't flinch. He turned to look at Ethan with the face of a man who had prepared for this specific moment and was performing his prepared response. "I don't know what you're talking about." "5th floor, your 2 guys, the document package staged for the board portal." Ethan kept his voice level. "The camera override. The fake maintenance update 6 weeks ago." He watched Marcus's face. "Your patrol rotation gaps. The tracking device on her car. The SUV in the parking lot 3 weeks ago." Nothing moved in Marcus's expression. That was actually the tell. The careful absence of surprise. Surprised people showed it even when they tried not to. People who were managing a prepared story showed exactly what Marcus was showing now. Nothing. "You've been busy," Marcus said. "So have you. 14 months of payments from Duran Group." A silence. A brief one. Then Marcus said, very quietly, "You don't know what you're dealing with." "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Ethan said. "The question is whether you want this handled here or whether you want to walk out of this building now before the board gets the documents I'm about to hand them." Something shifted in Marcus's face. The first real crack. "What documents?" "Everything, the financial records, the access logs, the corporate registry on Duran Group. The 3 payments. Ethan looked at him steadily. And something else. Something I found last night while I was taking apart your security deployment plan. He hadn't intended to say the last part, but he watched Marcus hear it and watched what happened to his eyes and knew that he'd been right about there being another layer. Something Marcus hadn't expected him to find. Something that went beyond the corporate conspiracy. Something that went back further. You were connected to the Meridian operation, Ethan said. It wasn't a question. It had come together in the small hours of this morning when he'd cross-referenced a name from an old intelligence contact roster against Duran Group's founding documents. A name that had appeared in both places. A name that connected Marcus Vane not just to corporate fraud, but to a covert operation 6 years ago that had gone wrong in ways that had never been publicly explained. An operation Ethan had been part of. An operation that had cost his closest teammate his life, and Ethan everything that came after. Marcus looked at him. The performance was completely gone now. What was underneath it was harder to read. Not guilt? Not exactly. Something more complicated than guilt. You don't want to open that door, he said. I've been standing in front of that door for 6 years, Ethan said. You put me there. You don't know. Danny Chen is dead, Ethan said. The name came out of him quiet and flat, the way you said the name of someone who had been dead long enough that the rawness had converted into something harder. He's dead because someone leaked our location during the extraction phase, someone who had access to the operation timeline. He kept his eyes on Marcus. Someone who knew we'd be at the Calvar checkpoint at 0300. Marcus said nothing. The after-action report blamed me, Ethan said. Failure to assess threat environment. Inadequate extraction protocol. That's what ended my career, and that's what I carried for 6 years. He paused. Because nobody looked at who else had the timeline. The auditorium behind them erupted in applause. Avery was reaching a key moment in the presentation. He could hear it in the quality of the crowd response, the sustained kind, not the polite mid-presentation kind. The sound washed over them and fell away. You're building a story, Marcus said. I'm documenting facts. With what evidence? Enough to open an investigation. And once an investigation opens, Ethan let that land. You know what investigations find when they actually look. For a long moment, Marcus stood very still. The controlled calm of him had an edge to it now, the kind of edge that came when someone's planning hit an obstacle it hadn't accounted for. He'd planned for many things. Ethan could see that. He'd planned for resistance, for confrontation, possibly even for exposure of the corporate fraud. He hadn't planned for Ethan to have found the Meridian connection. He hadn't planned for Ethan to come back from 8 years of quiet and still be exactly what he'd been. What do you want? Marcus said finally. I want you to walk out of this building tonight and not come back. That's all? No, but that's the first thing. Ethan looked at him without anger. Anger was a thing he'd moved past somewhere around 4 in the morning with the documents spread across his kitchen table and Danny Chen's name written in his notes for the first time in years. What he felt now was something that didn't have a clean word. Not satisfaction, not relief. Just the particular weight of something long unfinished beginning, finally, to be finished. The rest of it goes to the board and to the appropriate authorities, and you can deal with it in whatever legal process follows. Marcus looked at him for another moment. The thing behind his eyes was calculating. Ethan could almost watch it, the rapid assessment of remaining options, the inventory of what he had left to work with. What he had left to work with was very little. He straightened his jacket, reached up and unpinned the security badge from his lapel, set it on the podium beside the stage entrance with a small, precise movement, like he was returning something borrowed. Then he walked toward the exit. Ethan watched him go, watched him move through the crowd at the back of the auditorium without hurrying, without looking back, with the controlled bearing of a man who had not yet decided to stop performing. He went through the main doors and was gone. Ethan stood there for a moment. His left shoulder was aching from the hit he'd taken downstairs, and he rolled it once, slowly, and it complained about that too. On the stage, Avery was wrapping the presentation. Her voice was clear and steady, and the room was with her completely. 400 people leaning slightly forward in their seats, the particular posture of people who had stopped waiting to be impressed and were simply, genuinely impressed. She caught his eye from the stage. Just for a second, a brief look across the distance of the room, a question in it. He gave her one small nod. She held his gaze for half and delivered her final lines, and the applause that followed was the kind that started from the back and rolled forward and became something the whole room was doing together without deciding to, the kind you couldn't manufacture or plan for, the kind that happened when something was simply true. Ethan stood at the back of the room with his shoulder hurting and his thermos empty, and 6 years of a story that wasn't finished yet still moving through his chest, and he listened to the applause, and he let himself, for just a moment, stand still inside it. Marcus Vane did not go quietly in the way Ethan had hoped he would. He left the building that night, yes. He walked out through the main lobby with his badge left behind on the podium and his face arranged into the careful blankness of a man executing a retreat he'd decided to frame as a choice. But quiet was a relative term, and the silence Marcus maintained over the following 72 hours was not the silence of a man accepting consequences. It was the silence of a man repositioning. Ethan knew the difference. The board met in emergency session 2 days after the announcement event, convened at the request of Avery and 2 independent board members who had reviewed the preliminary documentation Ethan and Diane had assembled. It was a Saturday morning, which told you something about the urgency. Board members did not voluntarily give up their Saturday mornings for anything short of a genuine crisis, and this qualified. The meeting was in the 4th floor conference room. Long table, 8 chairs, the particular quality of institutional fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly worse than they felt. Avery sat at one end. The 7 board members filled the sides. Ethan sat against the wall, not at the table, which was where he preferred to be. Close enough to hear everything, outside the political geometry of who sat where and what it meant. He'd been in the building since 6 that morning, running on 5 hours of sleep, and the kind of focused calm that came when the operational phase of something was ending and the accounting phase was beginning. His shoulder had stiffened overnight, and he'd taken 2 ibuprofen in the parking structure before coming upstairs. The small indignities of a body that had absorbed too many years of hard use were not something he spent much time thinking about, but they were present, and they were not nothing. The board members had read the preliminary documentation. He could tell by the way they held themselves. 3 of them with the tightly controlled expressions of people processing something they hadn't expected and didn't like. 2 with the more guarded look of people waiting to see which way the room moved before they fully committed their faces to a reaction. And 2, the ones who had called for the meeting, with the straightforward gravity of people who had already done their processing and arrived at a position. The board chair was a man named Howard Ellison, 63, gray-haired, the kind of steady that came from 3 decades of navigating corporate governance and occasionally getting it wrong and learning from it. He opened the meeting without preamble. We're here because documentation has been presented suggesting that Marcus Vane, as Director of Security Operations, engaged in a coordinated effort to compromise the executive leadership of this company. We've all reviewed the preliminary material. I want to hear from Ms. Caldwell first, and then from Mr. Cole. Avery laid it out in 20 minutes. She was precise, and she was thorough, and she was visibly, carefully unemotional about it, which Ethan suspected was costing her more than it looked like. She covered the incident pattern, the travel calendar access, the tracking device, the Duran Group financial connection, the document package that had been staged for distribution during the announcement event, and the fraudulent authority transfer documents. When she finished, the room was quiet for a beat. Then Marcus Vane's attorney spoke. He had appeared 10 minutes into the meeting, a man named Fielding, brought in from a firm in Seattle, expensive suit, the practiced neutrality of someone who dealt with crises for a living. He'd been admitted to the room at Marcus's request, which the board had allowed because this was still a private corporate proceeding, and everyone was trying to avoid the optics of doing something that looked like a railroading before the evidence was fully established. Ethan had noted Fielding's arrival and said nothing. He'd expected it. "Mr. Ellison," Fielding said, "my client has asked me to convey that he disputes the characterization of these events and that he will be cooperating fully with any independent investigation. He also asks that the board consider certain information regarding Mr. Cole before treating his conclusions as authoritative." Howard Ellison looked at him over the top of his reading glasses. "What information?" Fielding set a folder on the table and slid it toward the center. "Mr. Cole's military record. Specifically, the after-action review of a covert operation approximately 6 years ago, in which Mr. Cole's judgment was formally cited as a contributing factor in the death of a fellow operator and the failure of the mission. My client suggests that the board consider whether an individual with this history is an appropriate source for accusations of this magnitude against a decorated corporate security professional. The folder sat in the middle of the table. Nobody reached for it immediately. Ethan looked at it from his chair against the wall. He'd expected this too, though expecting something didn't make the particular sensation of having your worst years opened up in a conference room and placed on a table for strangers to evaluate any more comfortable. It sat in his chest like cold weight, and he let it sit there, and he breathed, and he didn't move. Howard Ellison looked over at him. "Mr. Cole, would you like to respond?" Ethan stood up, moved to the table. He didn't take a seat. He stood at the end, across from Avery, and looked at the room steadily. "Yes," he said. "I'd like to respond." He'd spent 2 days preparing for this moment while simultaneously hoping it wouldn't be necessary. The documentation he'd assembled for the board had been built in 2 layers: the corporate conspiracy layer, which was what he'd presented through Avery, and the deeper layer, which he'd kept back. Not because he was hiding it, because he'd known, with the certainty of someone who had spent years reading how people like Marcus operated, that Marcus would go here if he felt cornered, would reach for the weapon that had worked before. Ethan had built the counter for it before Marcus knew he needed to use it. He took his own folder from the bag he'd brought and set it on the table. The after-action review in that folder was written 6 years ago based on information provided primarily by personnel connected to the operations oversight structure, he said. What it does not include is the access records for the operations tactical timeline, the document that specified extraction routes, checkpoint timings, and personnel positioning. He opened his own folder. Those records show that the operation timeline was accessed 6 hours before the extraction phase by a user credential assigned to a liaison officer attached to the Operations Intelligence Coordination Unit. He placed the first page in the center of the table. That liaison officer's personnel file places him in a consulting role for a private security firm during the years between his service separation and his employment at Caldwell Innovations. He placed the second page. That private security firm shared a registered agent with Duran Group, LLC, the same Duran Group that made 3 payments to a holding company connected to Marcus Vane over the past 14 months. He placed the third page. The name on the liaison officer's personnel file is Marcus Vane. The room was very still. Not the polite professional stillness of a board meeting managing a difficult topic. The different kind. The kind that happened when something landed that people hadn't been braced for. When the architecture of what they thought they were dealing with suddenly revealed a lower floor. They hadn't known was there. Howard Ellison had both hands flat on the table. He was looking at Ethan's documents with the expression of a man doing a very specific kind of math. Fielding said, "These records were obtained through official channels via a contact withstanding access to archived interagency personnel records." Ethan said, "I have the retrieval documentation. Everything in that folder has a sourced provenance." He looked at Fielding directly. "If your client would like to dispute the authenticity of the records, that process exists. But disputing them requires explaining why his personnel file places him in the operations intelligence structure, and why that structure's access logs show his credentials pulling the tactical timeline 6 hours before 4 people walked into an ambush." Fielding looked at his own folder for a moment. Then he looked at nothing in particular. He said nothing. One of the board members, a woman named Patricia Nguyen, who had been in the carefully guarded expression category 20 minutes ago, leaned forward. "Mr. Cole, you're saying Marcus Vane leaked your team's location during a covert operation 6 years ago. I'm saying the records create that question and that an independent investigation will answer it formally," Ethan said. "What I know for certain is that the after-action review that cited my judgment as a contributing factor in that operation was written without access to the timeline records I've just presented. Those records changed the picture of what happened." Patricia Nguyen looked at the documents. "For 6 years you carried a finding that may have been—" "Yes." She sat back. Something moved through her expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite anger. A compound thing. Howard Ellison took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. "I'm going to recommend to the board that we retain an independent forensic firm to conduct a full review of the Security Operations Division's records, the financial documentation presented here, and the events of the announcement evening. I'm also going to recommend that we engage outside legal counsel to assess the implications of the materials Mr. Cole has presented regarding the prior military matter. He looked around the table. Objections? Nobody objected. Marcus Vane is suspended pending investigation effective immediately, Ellison said. Mr. Fielding, I'd recommend you advise your client accordingly. The meeting broke up at noon. People filed out in the way people filed out of rooms where something heavy had happened. Not quickly, not with the usual post-meeting energy, but with a kind of deliberateness, like each person was carrying something and needed to be careful about how they moved with it. Avery stayed at the table until the room was nearly empty. Ethan stayed too, leaning against the wall again, watching her. She was looking at the documents in the center of the table, his and the one Fielding had brought, and her hands were flat on the table in front of her, and she was very still. 6 years, she said. Not to him exactly. More to the room. Yeah. He let you carry that for 6 years. She looked up. The man who caused the thing that ended your career sat across from me in meetings for 6 years, and I had no idea. There's no way you could have. That doesn't make it better. No, he agreed. It doesn't. She pushed back from the table and stood up, and for a moment she just stood there with her arms crossed, which was not her usual posture. She usually kept her arms looser, more open. The crossed arms were something she was doing to hold herself together, and she knew he could see it, and she didn't try to change it. Are you okay? She asked. And I mean that genuinely, not the polite version. He considered the question, actually considered it, which was something he didn't always do when people asked variations of it. I've been carrying something that wasn't mine for a long time, he said. Having it named in a room and put on a table and looked at, that's different from just knowing it privately. He stopped, tried again. It's uncomfortable, and also something else I don't have a word for yet. She looked at him. Relief? Maybe. He looked at the documents on the table. Ask me again in a month. She nodded. Then, unexpectedly, she said, Danny Chen. He looked at her. You said his name the other night, in the auditorium. She held his gaze. Was he a good person? Ethan was quiet for a moment. The question was a real one. Not a platitude, not a leading question, just a genuine inquiry delivered directly, which was how she asked most things. He was annoying, Ethan said. He talked too much, and he had terrible taste in music, and he was always 10 minutes late every single time, regardless of the circumstances. He paused. And he was the most reliably decent person I've ever worked with. The kind of decent that wasn't a choice he made. It was just what he was made of. Avery was quiet. He had a daughter too, Ethan said. She'd be about 12 now. He didn't say anything else, and she didn't push. She just stood there with him in the empty conference room for a moment, which was enough. The investigation moved faster than Ethan had expected. The independent forensic firm Howard Ellison retained was thorough in the methodical, expensive, unhurried way of firms that dealt with corporate fraud regularly and had learned that rushing produced findings that didn't survive legal scrutiny. But the documentation was clean. Ethan had made sure of that. And the digital evidence trail Marcus had left behind, obscured as it was, didn't survive professional forensic analysis intact. The financial connection to Duran Group was confirmed within the first week. The camera firmware override was confirmed within 10 days. The fraudulent authority transfer documents were authenticated and their origin traced to a workstation in the Security Operations Division. The two men from the 5th floor, both of whom had been detained that night with the cooperation of a federal contact Diane had activated, provided statements that corroborated the document staging operation in exchange for reduced exposure. The Meridian operation was referred to a separate federal review outside the corporate investigation, which was where it belonged. Ethan gave a formal statement to a federal investigator on a Tuesday afternoon in a downtown Portland office building that looked aggressively ordinary. The investigator was a woman in her late 40s with a long practitioner's patience for silence, and she let him talk at his own pace, and he told her everything he had, the access records, the personnel file connection, the timeline, all of it. He drove home to Briarpoint afterward and sat in his truck in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. The harbor was doing its usual thing in the dark, moving, restless, indifferent to anything that had happened on land. He sat there and listened to it. Then he went in, and made dinner. Marcus Vane's removal from Caldwell Innovations was formalized 3 weeks after the board meeting. The corporate charges were filed shortly after: financial fraud, illegal surveillance, conspiracy to commit corporate sabotage. The list was specific and documented, and it would take time to work through the legal process, as these things always did, but the facts were established and the accountability was, at minimum, in motion. The Meridian review was ongoing, which meant there was nothing public yet, and wouldn't be for months, possibly longer. Federal reviews moved on their own timeline, indifferent to the personal urgency of the people waiting on them. Ethan had made peace with that, or was in the process of making peace with it, which was not the same thing but was what was available. What changed immediately was smaller and in some ways more significant. The Security Operations Division at Caldwell Innovations was restructured under interim leadership. Garrett Lyle, the quiet analyst who had spent 3 years going pale every time Marcus walked past his desk, turned out to have been documenting irregularities in the security reporting for over a year, storing the records on a personal encrypted drive, unsure what to do with them and afraid of what would happen if he acted. When the investigation opened, he came forward with 11 months of documentation that corroborated nearly everything Ethan had found independently. Ethan met with him once, briefly, in a small conference room off the second floor. Lyle was a careful, precise man who wore his nervousness close to the surface and seemed to find direct eye contact slightly challenging. "Why didn't you report it earlier?" Ethan asked. Not as an accusation, as a genuine question. Lyle looked at his hands. "Because the person I would have reported it to was Marcus, and the person above Marcus was the board, and Marcus had relationships with 3 board members I didn't trust." He paused. "And because I'd watched what happened when people crossed him. There was a woman in finance 2 years ago who asked the wrong questions about some expense routing. 6 months later, she was gone. Performance review." He looked up. "I have 2 kids. I kept the records and I waited." Ethan nodded. "You kept them clean?" "Yes." "That mattered." Ethan meant it. "What you did mattered." Lyle looked at him with the expression of someone who had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to say that. The members of the security team who had participated in the training room confrontation on Ethan's first day, the 6 men who had expected an easy evaluation and gotten the opposite, had been watching all of this unfold with a complicated mixture of professional discomfort and something harder to name. They'd been Marcus's people in the sense that all hired professionals are their manager's people, which is to say they'd followed direction and trusted the structure they were inside of and hadn't asked the questions they should have asked, and now they were standing in the aftermath of a structure that had turned out to be built on compromised ground. Ethan didn't judge them for that. He understood it. One of them, the one he'd put down last in the training room, a man named Torres with a broken nose that had healed slightly crooked, and a way of listening that suggested he was smarter than he usually bothered to let on, found Ethan in the break room on a Thursday afternoon. "Can I ask you something?" Torres said. "Sure." "That first day, in the training room." Torres leaned against the counter. "You knew it was a setup." "Yes." "But you went through with it anyway." "I needed to see how it was run," Ethan said. "The setup told me as much as the evaluation." Torres was quiet for a moment. "We were wrong about you." "You were operating with bad information," Ethan said. "That's different from being wrong." Torres looked at him, then gave a single nod, the kind that acknowledged something and declined to make it larger than it needed to be, which Ethan appreciated. Avery called him at home one evening, 3 weeks after the board meeting. He was in the kitchen, Lily at the table doing homework, the usual evening domestic machinery running in the background. "The licensing deal closed," Avery said. "Officially. The $43 million is in. The company's position is better than it was before any of this happened, which is either resilience or irony. I haven't decided." "Congratulations," he said. "You earned it." "I had help." "You made the decisions. The help just pointed at things." A small pause. "The board is recommending we create a permanent security director role. Restructured. New reporting lines, new oversight framework." Another pause. "They want to offer it to you." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at Lily across the kitchen, who was chewing on her pencil and scowling at what appeared to be a math problem, and was paying no attention to him. "That's a generous offer," he said. "It's not generosity, it's practical." Her voice had the slight edge it got when she was being direct and knew it. "You're the best person for it." "That's probably not true." "It's what the board believes, and I agree with them." A beat. "You don't have to decide now. I just wanted you to know it's there." He looked out the kitchen window at the harbor. The fog was coming in early tonight, the way it sometimes did in the fall, softening the lights along the water into soft, warm blurs. "I'll think about it," he said. After he hung up, Lily looked up from her homework. "Who was that?" "The woman I've been working with in Portland." Lily considered this. "Is she nice?" "She's direct," he said. "Which is better." Lily thought about that for a moment, then apparently decided it was true and went back to her math problem. He stood at the counter and watched her work, and didn't think about Portland or board meetings or the Federal Review or the weight of a 6-year-old wound that was finally being looked at by the right people. He just stood there and watched his daughter do her homework, and it was enough. The formal board session that closed out the internal investigation was held on a Friday afternoon in early November, 41 days after the announcement event. Ethan attended as a witness and a subject of the proceedings, both simultaneously, which was a strange position to occupy. He sat at the table this time, not against the wall. Howard Ellison presented the investigation's findings in summary. Financial fraud confirmed, illegal surveillance confirmed, conspiracy to commit corporate sabotage confirmed, unauthorized access to executive private information confirmed. Marcus Vane's termination was formalized with cause, stripping any separation agreements or benefit entitlements. The findings were being forwarded to the district attorney's office and the relevant federal authorities. Then Ellison said something Ethan hadn't expected. "The investigation also reviewed the military record documentation introduced at our previous session," Ellison said. "While the formal military review is a federal matter outside our jurisdiction, I want to state for the record that the board found the documentation presented by Mr. Cole compelling and credible, and that the original characterization of that record was presented in this room by a party now confirmed to be acting in bad faith. I want that in the record." He looked at Ethan. "It should be there," he said. Ethan looked back at him. "Thank you." It wasn't an exoneration. The federal process would determine what that looked like and when it happened. But it was something. A room full of people who had looked at the facts and said, publicly and formally, that the version of events that had followed Ethan for 6 years was not the right version. He sat with that for a moment. Then the meeting continued, and there were other items, and the afternoon moved on the way afternoons did, and eventually it was over. He walked out of the building into a November afternoon that was gray and cold and smelled like rain coming. He stood on the sidewalk outside Caldwell Innovations and didn't do anything in particular for about 30 seconds, just stood there. His shoulder ached. His phone had 6 messages he hadn't read. Lily had a school thing tonight that he needed to be back for by 6. He checked his watch. It was just past 3. He had time. He started walking toward the parking structure, and somewhere in the middle of the walk, between the lobby doors and the elevator bank, on an ordinary stretch of sidewalk, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly, not relief exactly, not the particular emotional arrival that movies suggested moments like this produced. Something quieter. The feeling of a thing that had been pressing against you for so long, you'd forgotten what it felt like not to have it there suddenly, incrementally, cautiously, beginning to let go. He didn't trust it completely. He was not, by nature or by experience, a person who trusted sudden lightness. But he let himself feel it anyway, for the length of that walk, before he got in his truck and pointed it toward home. The Federal Review took 4 months and 11 days. Ethan knew this because he counted, not obsessively. Not the way he'd once counted things during bad stretches when sleep wouldn't come, and the dark had a particular quality to it that pressed on the chest, but in the quiet, practical way of someone waiting on a process that mattered and had no way to accelerate it. He went on with his life. He fixed engines in Briar Point. He drove Lily to school and picked her up and made dinner that was sometimes good and sometimes not, and sat with her while she did homework, and argued good-naturedly about whether birds could theoretically develop a communication system a human could learn, a debate that had been running since October with no sign of resolution on either side. He drove to Portland twice a month. Not for Caldwell Innovations. He'd declined the security director position, which had surprised the board and hadn't surprised Avery at all, but because Avery had asked him to consult on the redesign of the security division structure, which was a different thing, a bounded thing. He could do that. He came in, reviewed what they were building, gave his assessment, drove home. It didn't own him. The work on the security division redesign was, in its way, interesting. Avery had made decisions he wouldn't have expected from someone who'd just survived the kind of institutional betrayal she had. Most people who got burned badly inside a system responded by building the system tighter. More oversight, more restriction, more layers between the person at the top and the possibility of surprise. Avery went in the opposite direction. She'd decided that the flaw wasn't insufficient control, but insufficient honesty, and that what she needed was people who would tell her things she didn't want to hear before those things became problems, not after. So she built for that. She restructured the reporting line so security operations reported directly to a board subcommittee rather than through a single executive director. She created an internal disclosure channel, anonymous submission, independent review, specifically for employees who saw something and weren't sure who they could tell. She hired a retired federal investigator as an outside advisor with a standing mandate to review security operations quarterly and answer to no one inside the company. Garrett Lyle, the quiet analyst who had spent a year documenting irregularities on a personal encrypted drive and waiting, was given a formal role in the new structure, not as director, which he didn't want and wasn't suited for, but as an internal compliance lead with real authority and real protection. He'd seemed startled by the offer when Avery made it, then quietly and seriously grateful in a way that didn't require a lot of words. "You didn't have to do this," he'd told her. "I know," she'd said. "That's why it means something that I did." Ethan had been in the room for that exchange. He'd filed it away as one of the better things he'd witnessed in the course of all of this. The call came on a Thursday morning in late February. Ethan was under a boat at the harbor, a 40-foot commercial fishing vessel with a hydraulic winch problem that had been annoying its owner for 6 weeks, when his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He pulled himself out from under the machinery, checked the number. A Washington, D.C. area code he'd been waiting on. He wiped his hands and answered. The voice on the other end belonged to the federal investigator he'd met in the ordinary-looking office building 4 months ago. She got to the point in the way she'd always gotten to the point, which he'd appreciated then and appreciated now. "The Meridian review is complete," she said. "The findings have been finalized and the summary is being released to relevant parties today. I wanted you to hear it from me before you see it anywhere else." "Go ahead," he said. The review concluded that the tactical timeline for the Meridian extraction was accessed without authorization approximately 6 hours before the operation's final phase. The access was traced to credentials registered to Marcus Vane in his capacity as intelligence liaison. The review further concluded that this unauthorized access created a probable vector for the location compromise that resulted in the ambush at the Calvar checkpoint. A brief pause. The original after-action finding citing operator judgment as a contributing factor has been formally recommended for revision. That revision will be processed through the appropriate military records channels, but the investigative conclusion is clear. Ethan was standing on the dock. The harbor was doing its winter thing. Gray water, gray sky, the occasional gull, the smell of salt and diesel that he'd lived inside for 8 years without quite stopping to register it as a smell rather than just the air. He registered it now. "And Danny Chen?" he said. Another pause, slightly longer. The review's findings support the conclusion that Operator Chen's death resulted from the compromised location data rather than from failures in operational planning or execution. That conclusion will be included in the formal revision. He stood there on the dock for a moment. It was not the kind of news that produced a clean reaction. He'd known, privately, for 6 years that it hadn't been his fault, had known it with the particular knowledge that lived below language, that doesn't require external confirmation to exist, that just lives in you regardless of what the official version says. But the official version had a weight that the private knowledge didn't. It had lived on paper. It had followed him. It had been placed on a conference table by a lawyer trying to discredit him, and it had worked, briefly, on people who had no reason to question it, and now it was being revised. The paper was being changed. The version that had followed him was being replaced, through a slow and bureaucratic process, by the version that was true. He wasn't sure what he'd expected to feel. What he actually felt was tired and grateful and sad in a specific and irreducible way that had nothing to do with the legal findings and everything to do with the fact that the findings, however right, did not bring Danny Chen back. They clarified what had happened. They couldn't change that it had happened. "Thank you," he said, "for calling me directly."
"You deserve to hear it that way," she said. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Cole." She hung up.
He stood on the dock for another few minutes. Then he went back to the hydraulic winch. He told Lily that evening. Not everything. She was 7, and the operational details of a covert military extraction were not the kind of bedtime conversation that served anyone well. But she knew, in the general way that kids knew things their parents thought they'd kept private, that something had been weighing on him that related to his time before Briar Point. She'd never asked directly, which he suspected was her way of protecting him from having to explain it before he was ready, which was either very perceptive or very much like her mother had been, and possibly both. He sat at the kitchen table after dinner with the remains of the meal between them and said, "I got some news today, about something that happened a long time ago, before you were born." She looked at him with the careful attention she applied to things she understood were important. "Something that wasn't fair happened," he said, "and people blamed me for it. And today the people who investigated it said officially that it wasn't my fault." Lily considered this for a moment. "Did you already know that? That it wasn't your fault?" "Yes," he said, "but sometimes knowing something and having someone else confirm it are different." She thought about that. Then she said, "Like when I knew I hadn't taken Mrs. Abernethy's garden shears, but I still felt bad until she found them herself." He looked at her. "Exactly like that." She nodded, satisfied with the comparison. Then, "Do you feel better?" "Working on it," he said. "That's honest," she said, in the tone she used when she approved of something without wanting to make a big deal of it. They did the dishes together, which was their usual routine. She washed, he dried, a division of labor that had been established when she was 5 and had insisted she was old enough to wash dishes and had proceeded to prove it, albeit with a concerning amount of soap. She'd refined the soap situation over 2 years. He'd stopped worrying about it. That evening, doing dishes with his daughter in a kitchen in a small coastal town while a hydraulic winch waited for him at the harbor, and a federal finding process through military records channels in a city 4 states away, Ethan Cole felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt like he was in the right place. Not a destination, not an earned reward, just the right place, on this specific Thursday in February, doing this specific ordinary thing. It was not a dramatic feeling. It didn't announce itself. It was the kind of thing you might miss entirely if you were looking for something larger and more conclusive. He didn't miss it. The news about Marcus Vane came in spring. The district attorney's office had worked through the corporate fraud case methodically over the intervening months, building on the forensic investigation's findings and the statements of multiple witnesses, including the 2 men from the 5th floor who had staged the document package. The charges were substantial: financial fraud, conspiracy to commit corporate sabotage, illegal surveillance, and a separate count related to the unauthorized use of company systems. He pled guilty to 3 of the 4 charges 2 days before the trial was scheduled to begin, which was the move of someone who had done the math on a jury and decided that the documented evidence made conviction likely enough that a plea arrangement was the better option. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for late April. Ethan did not attend any of it. He followed it peripherally. A notification here, a brief from Diane there, but he made a deliberate choice not to center himself in that process. It was a legal proceeding about corporate crimes, and Marcus would be held accountable through it, and that was what it was. The other matter, the Meridian finding, was its own process, moving through its own channels, and the 2 things were related but distinct, and he was trying to hold them that way. What he found, as the weeks passed, was that the anger he'd expected to feel when the legal proceedings concluded wasn't quite what arrived. There was something, a residual heat that lived in him when he thought about the specific details, about Danny Chen's daughter who was 12 now and growing up without her father. That didn't go away, and he didn't expect it to. Some things you carried. You just learned what to do with what you carried. But the consuming fury he'd sometimes feared was in him, the kind that could take you over, reshape you around itself, turn you into the story of what was done to you rather than the person you actually were, that didn't materialize. He thought maybe it was because he'd never let it become his primary fuel. He'd left it on the dock, metaphorically, and gone back to the engines, and kept doing that. And somewhere in all that repetition, the fury had lost its claim on the center of him. I wasn't sure he'd done that deliberately. He might have just gotten lucky, temperamentally, but he tried to recognize it anyway. Avery called him on a Saturday morning in April, which was unusual because she typically observed the weekend boundary he'd established early on. Call him about work things during the week, and he'd respond promptly. Call him on weekends only if it was genuinely urgent. He answered because it was her, and because she didn't typically break the pattern. "I'm not calling about work," she said before he could ask. "Okay. I'm calling to tell you that we're launching the Veterans Transition Program next month. The one I mentioned." She'd told him about it in broad strokes a few months earlier. An initiative she was building at Caldwell Innovations to create structured pathways for veterans and single parents entering the private sector, with mentorship components and practical skills training rather than the symbolic gestures that most corporate programs substituted for actual support. "We have 12 participants in the first cohort, 4 veterans, 5 single parents, 3 who are both." "That's good," he said. "That's really good. I wanted you to know because you're the reason I built it this way." She said it plainly, not sentimentally, in the manner of someone stating a fact they'd thought through carefully before saying. "Not because you're some inspiration story. I know you hate that framing, but because watching how people treated you when you walked in here based on what you looked like and what you didn't have on paper, that stayed with me." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Lily was in the backyard making ambitious claims about teaching the neighbor's cat to sit, an endeavor that had been ongoing for 3 weeks with negligible results and undimmed enthusiasm. "Thank you," he said, "for building it the right way." "There's something else," Avery said. He waited. "I want to ask you to dinner." A brief pause. Not a meeting, not a working dinner, not a debrief or consultant check-in, just dinner, with me. Another pause, shorter. "I've been trying to figure out how to say that for about 6 weeks, for the record." He looked out the window at Lily, who was now sitting cross-legged in the grass with the cat in her lap, apparently having abandoned the sitting exercise in favor of just holding it, which the cat seemed to find equally objectionable but was tolerating. "6 weeks," he said. "I'm not impulsive," she said. "You know that by now." "I do." He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating exactly. The answer had been forming somewhere below the level of conscious decision for a while, and he recognized it now that she'd named the thing. "Okay," he said. A brief silence on her end. "Okay?" "Yes." "That's it? Just okay?" "I'm not impulsive either," he said. She laughed. It was a genuine laugh, slightly surprised by itself, which was the best kind. "Saturday. I'll send you a place. I'll drive myself." "I know," she said. "I'd expect nothing else." She hung up, and he stood at the kitchen window for a moment, and Lily came in through the back door with grass on her knees and an assessment of the cat situation. "The cat is not interested in learning things," she announced, "but it stayed in my lap for 20 minutes. "Progress," Ethan said. She considered this. "Progress," she agreed. He drove to Portland on a Saturday evening in late April with the windows slightly down because the weather had turned in the way Oregon weather sometimes did, abruptly and without the gradual warm-up that other regions offered. The evening was cool and clear, and the kind of specific blue that existed in the hour after sunset before the dark fully established itself. The restaurant Avery had sent him was not fancy in the way he'd half expected. It was a mid-sized Italian place in the Pearl District. Good lighting, not dramatic lighting, the sound level of a room where people were having actual conversations rather than performing them. He arrived 5 minutes early and told the host his name and was shown to a corner table and sat down and looked at the menu and felt, briefly and almost amusingly, nervous in a way he hadn't felt nervous in years. Not the operational kind of nervous, the human kind. The kind that was just about showing up as yourself in a situation that mattered, with nothing tactical to do and no threat to assess and no plan to execute, just sitting in a restaurant waiting for a person you respected and were beginning to understand you cared about, and hoping that the version of yourself you showed up as was a version worth showing up as. He'd spent so long being useful to people in crisis situations that the ordinary social mechanics of vulnerability had gotten rusty. He was aware of that. He figured being aware of it was at least a start. Avery arrived 4 minutes after him. She was in a dark jacket over a simple blouse, and she'd left her hair down, which he'd only seen once before, briefly, during a very late evening in her office when she'd taken it out of its usual practical tie and forgotten to repin it. She looked like herself, not a dressed-up version, just herself, which was either effortless or careful effort that looked effortless. And he'd learned enough about her to suspect it was the latter. She sat down and looked at the menu and then looked at him. "You're nervous," she said. "Occupational hazard of being honest." "You're not usually nervous." "I'm usually doing something specific," he said. "This is less specific." She smiled at that, the real one, not the professional version. "Me too, for what it's worth." "It's worth something," he said. They ordered, they talked. Not about Caldwell innovations, not about security protocols or board meetings or the Federal Review. They put all of that away deliberately and without discussion, as if they'd both arrived at the same decision about it independently. They talked about other things. She'd grown up in Sacramento, the third of 4 kids. Her father a civil engineer who'd worked on water infrastructure projects and had a rigorous belief in the moral importance of making things that actually functioned. She'd absorbed that belief and rerouted it through technology, which she'd understood early had the same potential as water infrastructure and somewhat higher margins. She was funny in the dry, observational way that people were funny when they were smart, and had spent years in rooms full of people who took themselves very seriously. He told her about Briar Point, about how he'd come there 8 years ago following Lily's mother, who had grown up in a small coastal town and missed it toward the end in a way that made him want to give her the thing she was missing, and had died before she'd had more than 6 months of it, which was the particular cruelty of timing that he'd eventually stopped trying to make sense of. He told her about the workshop on Harbor Road and the outboard motors and the hydraulic winches and the way the salt air got into everything, your clothes, your tools, the wood of your house, and how he'd stopped resisting it years ago and just accepted it as the texture of where he lived. She listened the way she did most things, with full attention, without performing her attention, without the slight glaze that people developed when they were waiting for their turn to talk. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The other life." He thought about it. The real answer, not the easy one. "I miss who I was before I understood what it cost," he said. "That version of me believed things were cleaner than they were, that the right side was obvious and the wrong side was obvious, and your job was to find the right side and hold it." He turned his glass slightly on the table. "I don't actually want that back, but I miss having it." "That's a very specific kind of grief," she said. "Yeah. I think I understand it, actually." She looked at the table for a moment. "I spent 6 years building a company with people I trusted, and one of them was systematically taking it apart. I don't want to go back to not knowing that, but there's a version of the last 6 years that felt cleaner that I can't have anymore." "You trust differently now," he said. "I do." She looked up. "I'm not sure if that's loss or just reality." "Probably both," he said. "They're not always different things." She nodded. Then she said, "I think you're one of the most honest people I've met. And I mean that in the specific way, not that you tell the truth all the time, because most people technically tell the truth most of the time. I mean that you don't perform a version of yourself. You're the same person in the training room and in the conference room and apparently in a restaurant." He looked at her. "Is that interesting or boring?" "Extremely interesting," she said, "and a little bit inconvenient." "Inconvenient how?" "Because it makes you difficult to categorize," she said. "And I'm very good at categorizing people, and I like having things in categories. And I don't fit. You fit fine," she said. "That's the inconvenient part. I expected you not to fit, and you did, and now I have to reconfigure the category." He looked at her across the table in the good light of the restaurant, and something in him that had been running on a low, quiet hum for a very long time settled into a different register. Not louder, not dramatic, just different. The way a room sounded different when you opened a window you hadn't known was closed. They walked for a while after dinner, which neither of them had planned, but which happened naturally when the meal was done, and neither of them moved toward the obvious end of the evening. The Pearl District at 9 o'clock was still moving. Restaurants, a few bars, people out in the mild April night with the specific energy of a city that had been cold for too long and was grateful for the change. They walked without a particular direction. The board approved the Veteran Transition Program budget this week, she said at some point. Full allocation. You mentioned that. I know. I'm telling you again because it still makes me happy. She glanced at him. Is that allowed? Being happy about good things? Yes. Generally recommended, he said. She laughed again. He was beginning to catalog her laughs. The professional one, which was short and correct. The real one, which came slightly sideways and surprised itself. And this one, which was quieter and existed in the space between amusement and something warmer. They stopped at a corner, and she looked at him. I'm not going to pretend I know what this is, she said. I'm also not the kind of person who pretends things are casual when they're not. So I'll just say, I'd like to keep having dinner with you, non-professionally. And I wanted to say that directly instead of hoping you'd somehow understand it. He looked at her. The directness of her, which he'd encountered in a training room hallway, and a late office, and a board meeting, and a dozen smaller moments, was, he thought, one of the things he liked most about her. It cost something to be that direct. Most people didn't pay that cost consistently. I'd like that too, he said. Also directly. She smiled, the real one. Good. They stood at the corner for another moment, and then said goodnight in the practical way of two people who were not going to rush anything and both understood that, and he walked back to his truck in the clear April night and drove home. He got back to Briar Point at 11:30. Mrs. Abernethy from next door had been with Lily, an arrangement that had become routine enough that Lily had started referring to her simply as Abernethy, which Mrs. Abernethy found either funny or offensive depending on her mood. He thanked her, saw her out, went upstairs. Lily was asleep. He stood in her doorway for a minute, as he sometimes did. She was 8 now, had turned 8 in January, requested a birthday cake that was chocolate on the outside and vanilla on the inside because, she'd explained, it was more interesting to surprise people. He'd made it himself, badly, and she'd eaten 2 pieces and declared it perfect, which was a generous assessment of his baking. He stood in the doorway of her room and thought about the thing he'd felt earlier at the restaurant, the window opening, the register changing, and thought about whether he trusted it. He didn't entirely. He was not a person who trusted things immediately, and he wasn't going to start now. But he thought that maybe the point wasn't to trust it immediately. Maybe the point was to not be so afraid of what it might cost that you refused to let it be there at all. He'd spent a long time protecting himself from the cost of things. The cost of caring about outcomes. The cost of letting people matter. The cost of building something that could be taken. He'd told himself it was wisdom, and some of it was. But some of it was just fear wearing wisdom's clothes. Danny Chen hadn't been afraid of those costs. He'd talked too much and been chronically late, and had terrible taste in music, and he'd also been the kind of person who walked into danger without spending too much time negotiating with his own fear about it. And Ethan had spent 6 years missing him and only recently started asking what that might mean for how he was living. He thought maybe it meant something like this, that the people who had mattered to him and who he had mattered to had not been mistakes despite the cost. That the workshop in Briar Point and the harbor and the cold coffee and the lighthouse drawings were not a hiding place. They were a life, a real one, and they'd served him and Lily well and would continue to. But a life could be more than one thing. It could grow. It could let people in without ceasing to be itself. He told Lily once, standing at the kitchen counter with cold coffee, that people changed. She'd said people got boring. He didn't think he was finished yet. The months that followed were not a resolution in the way that word implied a clean conclusion. Life was not a clean conclusion. The federal process around the Meridian findings moved through its bureaucratic channels, and eventually, in late summer, a formal revision to Ethan's military record was processed and finalized. He received a letter confirming it. He read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in the drawer of his desk in the workshop where he kept important documents. Then he went back to the hydraulic winch he'd been working on. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He wasn't sure what ceremony would have meant or who it would have been for. The revision was right, and it was real, and it was recorded in the proper place. And Danny Chen's record was updated too, and Danny's daughter, whose name was Mara, he'd learned, and who was 12 and apparently playing softball, would grow up with a version of her father's story that was true. That mattered more than any ceremony. Marcus Vane was sentenced in May to 4 years on the fraud and conspiracy charges, reduced from the potential maximum in exchange for the information he'd provided during plea negotiations about the individuals who had funded the Duran Group operation. Ethan didn't attend the sentencing. He read the summary Diane sent him, noted the outcome, and moved on. He'd made peace with the fact that justice in practice was a practical and imperfect mechanism, not a dramatic one, and that the outcome was sufficient even if it wasn't fully satisfying, and that fully satisfying was probably an unrealistic standard for any human process. Avery and he had dinner again in May and in June, and eventually the dinners stopped being events and became part of the regular texture of things, which was how he knew they were real. She met Lily in July, which had been Lily's idea. She'd asked, with characteristic directness, "When do I get to meet the Portland person?" And the afternoon had been not seamless, because nothing with new people was ever seamless, but genuinely good. Lily had shown Avery the lighthouse drawing and explained why she'd given it to her father on that particular Tuesday, which she described as a day he needed something to look at that wasn't a problem. And Avery had looked at Ethan over Lily's head with an expression that he decided not to try to interpret and just let be what it was. He never took the security director role at Caldwell Innovations. He thought about it seriously, which was different from before. Before, he'd declined without fully imagining himself in it. When he imagined himself in it seriously, he found that what he saw didn't match what he wanted his life to look like. He wanted to remain useful. He didn't want to remain in the machinery of high-stakes corporate protection as a permanent condition. He'd done that job and done it well, and it had needed to be done, and that was enough. What he did instead was something Avery proposed more casually, as an idea rather than an offer, an advisory role with the Veteran Transition Program. Informal, irregular, meeting with cohort participants who were navigating the specific and strange passage from military or single-parent survival mode into something that looked more like an ordinary life. Talking to them not as an expert or a success story, but as someone who had made that passage imperfectly and could say with authority that imperfect was fine, that imperfect was actually the only way it came. He was good at it. Not because he was inspirational, he resisted that framing every time it appeared, but because he was honest, and because the people sitting across from him could tell the difference between someone performing recovery and someone actually living it. The first cohort finished the program in September. At the closing session, a small gathering in one of the Caldwell Innovations conference rooms, nothing elaborate, coffee, and some food someone had ordered, a woman named Reyes, one of the veteran participants, gave a short speech. She'd been in the Navy for 8 years, had gotten out after her second deployment, spent 2 years in a fog she described with the particular economical honesty of someone who had processed it enough to name it without needing to perform it. She was starting in a data analysis role at a Portland tech company in 2 weeks. At the end of her speech, she looked at Ethan. "You told us in the first week that the transition felt wrong because we were waiting for it to feel right," she said. "That the feeling we were waiting for wasn't coming and we should start doing the thing anyway." She paused. "I think about that a lot." He nodded. He wasn't sure what to say to that, so he said the thing that was true. "You did the work. That's yours." She nodded back in the way people nodded when they were accepting something they'd half believed anyway and were glad to have confirmed. On a Saturday morning in October, Ethan and Lily drove up the coast to a bluff she'd found on a school field trip and wanted to show him. It was an hour north of Briar Point, a hiking trail that was just ambitious enough to require real walking and just manageable enough for an 8-year-old who had strong opinions and reasonable stamina. They walked for an hour through second-growth fir and coastal scrub, Lily talking most of the way about the geology of coastal bluffs, which she'd apparently researched specifically for this outing, and about the bird they kept seeing that she insisted was a varied thrush, and he kept misidentifying, and about whether the neighbor's cat had what it took to eventually learn one command if they were patient enough. "I think the cat is simply not motivated," she said. "Some people aren't motivated by the same things," he said. "The cat isn't motivated by anything. That's different. The cat's motivated by being warm and fed." She considered this. "That's kind of enough, actually." "It's not nothing," he agreed. They came out on the bluff in the mid-morning, and the view was the kind that stopped conversation naturally. Not because it was overwhelming, but because it was simply there. The Pacific extending west without interruption, the sky doing the thing it did over open water where it seemed larger than it did inland, the light cold and clear and without sentiment. Lily stood at the edge of the trail where it opened onto the viewpoint and looked out for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Is this what you were looking at?" she asked. "When you used to stare at stuff?" He stood beside her. The wind off the water had some weight to it this time of year, the kind that reminded you what season was coming. "I don't know what I was looking at," he said. "I think I was looking for something without knowing what it was." "Did you find it?" He looked out at the water, the gray-green Pacific, indifferent and enormous and always moving, the way it had been when he'd stood on the dock in February with the federal investigator's voice in his ear, and before that, and further back, and all the years in between. "I think so," he said. "Mostly." She nodded, satisfied with mostly, because she was a person who understood that mostly was often the honest answer, and that honest answers were worth more than clean ones. They stood there for a while without talking. The wind moved through the firs behind them. The ocean did what oceans did, which was to keep going regardless of what was happening on land, which was either indifferent or reassuring depending on when you were looking at it. Today it was reassuring. Ethan stood on a bluff beside his daughter on a Saturday morning in October, a year and some change from the phone call he'd almost not answered, and he felt the specific and ordinary weight of a life that was his, imperfect, unresolved in some places, carrying what it carried, and genuinely, quietly his, and he let it be enough. It was.